All right, good morning. We're going to get going. In January of 2014, 11 economists, 1 lawyer, and 3 political strategists walked into a bar. True, they walked into a bar at the Wakefield Inn in Quebec to begin work on what would become Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission. The commission launched to the public about 10 months later in November of 2014, and its mandate was, and here I will allow myself some geeky economics parlance, its mandate was basically P squared, R squared. Price pollution, recycle the revenues. This was an old idea, easily 75 years old, if not 100 years old, but it was not one that was used much in practical policy making in Canada. And this group, this fun-loving group of economists, lawyers, and political strategists, was convinced that it would be good for Canada's environment and its economy if our governments at all levels used more policies like this for water pricing, for garbage pricing, for congestion pricing, for pricing environmental risks, and of course, for carbon pricing. Climate change was the focus of roughly 3/4 of the work of the Eco-Fiscal Commission. The Commission was funded with about $7.5 million over 6 years, not a penny of which came from any government. All of that money was donated by 9 family foundations and 2 corporations. During the 6 years of its activity, the Eco-Fiscal Commission generated 19 reports, 74 op-eds or essays, 193 stakeholder briefings, 254 public presentations, 355 blog columns, 9,672 media mentions, plus some that happened after we closed operations, and over 2 million YouTube video views, none of which are about your favorite cat. How about the Commission's impact? Well, it's always extremely hard to establish a line of causality from an idea or a report or a conversation to a change in policy. But we like to think that we improved the public debate about pollution pricing in this country and helped several governments see their way to adopting these policies over the past decade. In December of 2019, the Commission wound up its operations after releasing its final report. And at that time, we had $755,000 left over. So the donors agreed to sign the money over to the Max Bell School of Public Policy if we promised to hold an annual conference for the next 10 years on issues at the heart, at the spirit of the Eco-Fiscal Commission. So issues at the intersection of the economy and the environment. Then a pandemic happened. So we would have had, without a pandemic, I think we would have had 3 events, but the pandemic happened, and so here we are. So welcome to the first of 10 of these events that will take place over the next 10 years. My name is Chris Reagan. I was very proud to be the chair of Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission, and I'm now equally proud to be the director of the Max Bell School of Public Policy here at McGill. So welcome to Montreal, welcome to McGill, and of course, welcome to spring. It's actually pretty nice out there today. The Max Bell School and McGill University are situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange between Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which we now gather to spend time together and share and debate our ideas. I encourage you to think about Canada's Indigenous people and their attachment to the land as you participate in today's conference, because the role of Canada's many Indigenous peoples will, I think, be profound as we plan for our coming energy transition. And that, of course, is the theme of today's conference. Today's theme is not really about climate policy per se. There probably won't be big discussions about the details of carbon pricing or, thank you, Pedro, or household rebates, or EV subsidies, or clean fuel standards. Instead, the theme for today is about 3 big policy challenges that we will need to confront if we are serious as a country about making a massive energy transition over the next few decades. One panel discussion is about the disruptions in the labor market that are likely to occur, maybe even sure to occur, and what policies we need to address those disruptions. Another panel discussion is about the political and regional tensions that will come with energy transition and the partnerships, including with Indigenous peoples, that we will need to build in order to accomplish this transition and to build the infrastructure that we will need along the way. Our keynote speaker this afternoon is Sheila Watt-Cloutier, who will discuss the urgency of dealing with climate change from her perspective as an Inuit woman and a human rights activist. Her book, The Right to Be Cold, has got to be the best Canadian title I've seen in many years. But we will start off today's conference with a panel discussion about money and investment. How will we mobilize the financial capital necessary to build the many things we will need to build as an essential element of the coming energy transition? What tax policies will we need? What should be the mix between private and public investment, and maybe some other issues as well? I'm very pleased to introduce the moderator for our first panel, Paul Boothe, immediately to my left. Paul is a longtime economics professor at the University of Alberta and a tax specialist. He's a former Deputy Minister of Finance in Saskatchewan. He's the former Associate Deputy Minister in Finance Canada and at ISED, former Deputy Minister of Environment Canada, and most crucially, of course, he was an Eco-Fiscal Commissioner. That was a bit of a joke, but for the next time I speak, I will work on my delivery. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'm turning it over to Paul Boothe, who will then introduce his panel. Thank you very much. Take it away.
Microphone working? Everyone can hear me? Good, great. So thanks for inviting me. It's great to be back in Montreal and here at McGill. And thanks for recruiting this great panel for us to have the first conversation of this conference. And Chris's marching orders to me was to try to generate a conversation among these folks. So we're going to prize pithiness and try to stay away from long speeches. I'll get the ball rolling in a second, but let me just introduce my colleagues here. You all have their longer introductions on the website and in the materials that you have. So I will just say that starting with Rachel Samson. Rachel is the Vice President of Research at the Institute for Research of Public Policy, and which is based here in Montreal. She has a long career as an environmental economist. She worked at Environment Canada. We worked together there, and also at Finance Canada, and also with international organizations like the OECD. So we're very glad to have Rachel with us. Paul Rochon is now an executive advisor at Deloitte, previously and perhaps best known as a long-serving Deputy Minister of Finance and senior finance official. He did some other deputy jobs in his past, but also G7 deputy for Canada, so has a very good read on international developments. And last but not least, Leah Lawrence, who since 2015, so very long standing by Ottawa standards, the President and CEO of Sustainable Development Technology Canada. And I will say in her defense that Leah is an engineer by training and not an economist. So
I have a master's in economics.
Okay. Well, we won't hold that against you. I was trying to highlight your engineering expertise. Anyway, so we've got a great group here, and maybe I could just kick things off with a little bit of kind of stock taking. And I know Chris said this was really not about It was really about energy transition and not about carbon pricing. So I'm not going to start out by asking about carbon pricing. But I think, this is all in service of our efforts to meet our 2030 targets and our 2050 targets. And, it was 2015 now that a new government was elected in Canada and, made a commitment. A big part of its platform was a commitment to get serious about climate change. So I guess where I'll start is, with you, Rachel, what kind of progress have we made since 2015? Are we well and truly into this transition, or is it still to come?
Well, there are a number of different ways to measure progress. If we look purely at emissions, then it's been fairly steady with some small declines. But if we look at emissions intensity, there's been quite a significant reduction. And so emissions intensity is greenhouse gas emissions per dollar of GDP. And so it's what we call this decoupling, where hopefully GDP continues to grow and greenhouse gas emissions decline. So that's the trajectory that we want to see. But there's still a huge challenge ahead. Particularly if we look at the 2030 target, that's really soon, less than 7 years away, and we still have over 200 megatons of emissions to reduce. So that's going to be a huge challenge. I would note that I think that we need to start looking at the objectives we're trying to achieve in a broader way, so that we're not just so focused on the emission reductions, we're thinking about the transformation of our economy and society at the same time.
Okay. I think it's good for us to recognize that emissions were pretty flat over the period, but we got a big down step for COVID, and emissions have gone up a little bit in 2021 given the most recent government numbers. So really, I think it's fair to say that the jury is kind of still out on whether we've really started our transition and we got a bit of a boost from the COVID-related slowdown, or whether we still have to kind of get things into gear in terms of reducing emissions. Maybe I could go to Leah next. Leah, you've been in your job since 2015, not focusing just on the work of STTC, but your kind of viewpoint of the economy more generally. Like what kind of technological changes have you seen over that period? Not looking at GHG numbers, but your view of what's happening out in the real world. What have you seen?
Yeah, and I love that framing of the real world. Small economics joke, because I only have very little bit of economics training compared to you folks, but someone said to me once, the thing about the real world is just another economic model, and I thought that was a pretty great pithy statement. But building on what Rachel just said, I think the biggest change, and this gets to the technology deployment, the biggest change I've seen since 2015 is this understanding that we have a big gap in know-how, technologies, and how to implement them between where we're at today and where we need to be. And so really the dialogue, I think, in particular since 17, but since 15 as well, has changed in public policy and implementation, which is where I work most often, to what is innovation policy in this realm, and how do we need to get there? And innovation policy, and Chris talked about, maybe this is why the panels are structured as they are, innovation policy really gets to, do the people implementing new technologies know how to get them to market and scale them up as quickly as possible, so that in the end you get the emission reductions you need. And I think in that way, I'll be an engineer for you now, the world's not linear, it's exponential. So right now we're in this really tough slog of having people figure out the know-how of what technologies might work, for the ones that won't, fast failing them, and for the ones that will, training a whole bunch of people as fast as possible to do every kind of thing from engineering to finance to make sure they happen. And that's why I'm really actually more positive than I've ever been, having worked on this for as long as you folks have, because I can see the transition of implementation going from R&D to the folks I used to work with in the energy sector, large operational engineering departments, figuring out how do you commercialize hydrogen? How do you commercialize electric vehicles? How do you figure out how to get zero waste in mining, to your point of having a broader viewpoint? And that, I think, is the biggest thing that's happened since 15. And so, I could give you, I'm a tech geek, as you alluded, and so I could give you 1,000 examples of that, which is what we need. Every sector needs to transform. Every sector has its own GHG and emission or water intensity problems, et cetera. So how do we mobilize that and think about that? And I think that's a really interesting public policy problem where I'm not an expert, because how do you fast fail? How do you encourage firms to invest, take risk, knowing that a lot of this stuff might not work at first? And how do you be flexible about that in your economy as you transition it?
So, going from that fairly positive engineering view of the world, let's go back to the dismal science and ask Paul. Paul, I mean, since 2015, a whole bunch of tax and spending measures have been put in place in service of reaching these targets. I mean, in this kind of initial stock taking, like what are the big things that we've done? So on the tax and spending side.
Well, I mean, the big thing we've done is we've put in place a system of carbon taxation, and kind of most easily understood at the consumer level, where we pay, $1 per ton based on the carbon intensity of the fuel that we use in our cars, largely. On the corporate side, it's a much more complicated structure, where we, as a country, are struggling with many things as it relates to this transition. Among the biggest things that we're struggling with is the fact that we're a small but very open economy that's trade exposed. And most of our emitters either are producing products that they're selling in international markets where they're price takers, or they're import competing. Think cement, steel in an import competing context. And so on the industrial side, where you're looking at, I don't know, Rachel, 300 or so of the 700 megaton problem, might be a little higher than that. The thing that we're really struggling with is how do we put in place a regime where we incent decarbonization but don't destroy our competitive position. And if you destroy your competitive position, obviously you reduce GDP, but you don't necessarily actually achieve your climate goals, because you might just displace everything that you're doing in Canada to another country. And so what we've come up with is this intensity-based system, which effectively taxes the large emitters relatively lightly, think 20% per unit of output, and leaves them with a bit of a conundrum then as to, well, what is the real incentive to decarbonize? And you're seeing the federal government and other governments struggling with that. We have a carbon tax associated with a series of investment tax credits and a bunch of funds. And so I would say, the really positive news in all this is I think we've put in place structures that we can work with, that make sense, that are largely market-based. But I think we're a long way from actually having sorted out how to make that structure work in the context of an economy that's very export dependent. And the US Inflation Reduction Act, no matter what you think of the title, in a sense has focused our problem in this area, because the US has said, I'm just going to subsidize this stuff. And I'm going to subsidize it through something called a production tax credit, which says to industries, they're looking at various types of decarbonization activities. If you decarbonize, I'll give you a subsidy of X dollars a ton. So if you're doing carbon capture and storage, roughly speaking, it's $85 a ton. We don't have an equivalent to that in Canada. And that, I think, is our biggest challenge.
Well, okay, well, let's come back to that. But before we finish our stock taking, let me ask Rachel one more question. And that is, Chris mentioned the Eco-Fiscal Commission, and there are some other eco-fiscal commissioners here. But one of the things about eco-fiscal was that we were all about carbon pricing. And yet, hate to bring this up, but most of the big reductions that we've seen in emissions in Canada to date have come about because of regulations, not pricing, regulations. And you were part of that. So what about regulation and the role of regulation, at least so far, in terms of reducing emissions and helping us have a transition in our energy system?
So I think, like most economists, I would love to have a price on emissions, on every ton of emissions throughout Canada and also throughout the world. And if we had certainty on that price far into the future, I don't think we would need other policies. But we don't have a price on 100% of emissions in Canada, and there is a lot of uncertainty about whether that price will remain in place for the next 10, 20 years or go on the trajectory that has been outlined. And that creates a lot of investment uncertainty. And so we need other measures in order to provide that certainty, and also to deal with big capital investments. So, we tend to think of the transition as this smooth, moving along the marginal abatement cost curve process where pricing would work well to provide that marginal incentive and have incremental change, starting with the least cost actions. But what we actually have is really expensive, huge capital investments that need to be made. And providing that incentive for private sectors to make those investments is going to require some additional measures from governments.
Paul?
Can I just jump in on that? Because I think I agree with everything Rachel said. I think it raises another dimension that we haven't talked about yet, and that is the political difficulty of reducing carbon. And I think it's politically difficult because it involves a redistribution of income. And there's a question of, the other way to maybe put it is, who's going to pay for it? And who's going to pay for it as between the corporate sector versus the household sector? Who's going to pay for it as between Ontario and Alberta? And probably even within income cohorts that I haven't thought about deeply enough. And so I think a lot of, we tend to talk about these problems, in fairly technical terms, and we're talking about the various instruments that we are discussing and thinking about and trying to design and adjust. But I don't think we should ever lose sight of the fact that, well, I'd say two things. One, it's only going to be driven by policy. I'm convinced of that. And it's only going to be driven by policy because fossil fuels, I think, are going to remain the cheapest and most convenient form of energy. And so there'll always be, if you just let the world evolve, the world's going to evolve along a fossil fuel line. And you're kind of seeing that, frankly, with, we're going to hit the highest level of coal consumption this year. So that's number one. And then these political things kind of just, I think, are just massive, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. And it's not an easy problem to solve. and so although we talk about the instruments, a lot of the kind of core problem of decarbonization relates to how do you deal with the income redistribution issues that fall out of that. Yep.
This actually brings to mind a question that I wanted to ask Leah, and it's something that we started talking about a little bit about before the panel began, actually. And not focused on SDTC in particular, although you'll have some examples about this. But we just saw the announcement a day or two ago of a big incentive to Volkswagen to build a plant, a battery plant in Canada. Very big number attached to that. I mean, the issue that always arises when governments try to make these policy choices is about picking winners. Are we trying to pick winners? Do we need to pick winners? You've been in this business for a long time now. What's your kind of sense? What's your philosophy on the way this has to work in the real world?
Well, in the real world, I think there are three things. Every time you cut a check, you picked a winner. So we should stop telling ourselves we're not picking winners, because 1 point whatever billion it was, we picked a winner there.
Right. We hope it's a winner. Time will tell for sure. But I think there's a myth we tell ourselves that in anything, operational or policymaking, that a choice we make doesn't pick winners and losers. I think they all do. And I think the challenge in that is, and having only worked in Ottawa for 8 years, which is a long time for some folks, but not so long for others, we think that the people that come to Ottawa and lobby for particular policy change are representative of Canada. And so, for example, what I would say is that and our team deals almost exclusively with small and medium-sized enterprise who don't have time to lobby. Yet all of the policies that might be distributive in this realm that we're talking about will impact them directly. And why that matters to me so passionately is if you read innovation literature, if you read some of the stuff that has come out of disruptive innovation literature, the SMEs are the ones that are most likely to help with some of the transformative change that we need. And they have no voice or agency in a lot of the macroeconomic discussions that we have, and in fact are usually disenfranchised because they don't have a lobbying voice. So what I would say is, to your point, we already are picking winners and losers. We need to understand better the distributive effects of that. And to the BMW investment, maybe I'll just give you an example of some work that we did recently with the Department of Finance. So what we did was we said, okay, can we map the SME ecosystem related to battery chemistry development in Canada, which, by the way, we're really good at. Great university system, thinking about new existing battery chemistries and how you manufacture them better and get more efficiency out of them, and then what are the new ones that might emerge given real national security constraints related to cobalt and other kinds of rare earths. So we did this mapping. And what was really interesting is that there are, just looking at the companies that we don't know of, which means probably there are many more, there are probably, 50 or more companies working on the different elements of current and next generation battery chemistries, even in this Montreal down to Toronto corridor. Are those people known? Yeah, to our little agency, but not probably to most people. And you would have seen, if you happen to read, just expanding on that example, there was a group of 50 companies in Canada who built a concept car called Aero. Did you guys see this? These are all companies in this region and beyond who are thinking they could build all components of a car, which is what Canada does. We build components and assemble. We're really good at that in this area. Not just this generation, for next, for EVs. And there's a group in Vancouver thinking about the same kind of thing for hydrogen vehicles. So if we're going to pick winners, we should think about what's the trajectory of technology bets that might need to be made in automotive, for example, given all the sustainability stuff and the economic stuff too, in the context of national
policy making as it's happening today, where China, United States, Europe are trying to actually own some of these spaces. Small open economy has to be cognizant of that. We're not going to beat them at their game. And then how do we fit in? And I think that really is the thing I struggle with, or keeps me up at night, is I can see such potential, and I can see we're starting to move in certain directions, but I can also see that it can easily be blocked because these aren't a big, well-known group that has agency within our political system.
Yes, and when I think about that, especially when you talk about that car, I was reminded, I had a part of my career where I was very involved in the auto industry, and I'm still very interested in it. I read yesterday that half of the new vehicle sales in China next year will be EVs. Wow, that's a big number, and a big number compared to what EV sales will be in Canada or the US or North America in general. So let's come back to that. But before we get too far down the track, I want to come back to something Paul said, and that is, Paul, you talked about the sort of pretty straightforward, I pay the carbon tax when I gas up my car or have my natural gas to heat my house, but it's complicated for firms. And for some big emitters, we talked about this, compared to the $65 per ton carbon tax that we're paying on automobile fuel, the carbon tax on heavy emitters can be really low, like less than $5. So my question for you is, have we got this right? I understand we've got competitiveness issues and want to get the incentives right. Have we got it right? And I guess to go along with that, is there something that's missing to really make this work, especially given this Inflation Reduction Act development in the U.S.? So could you say something about that?
Well, I think we've got many of the components right, and that's not just a gratuitous statement. I think the components we put in place, both on the household and the business side, are material, and they were hard to do. I think where we struggle, and if I'd say where we still don't have it right, is we still haven't got our head wrapped around the fact that firms actually aren't going to undertake these investments. Well, actually, let me start in a slightly different place. If the rest of the world were taxing carbon, I wouldn't be saying what I'm saying. But the rest of the world effectively is not taxing carbon, at least not our competitors in most of the markets into which we're selling. So think oil and gas. And that creates a legitimate challenge for Canada. And in that context, what we still haven't either understood or been willing to accept is that firms actually aren't going to be making these investments if they provide no value. Because if they go ahead and make an investment that provides no value, it's just going to destroy their enterprise value. Price of stock's going to fall, all kinds of stuff. And so what they'll do in a Canadian context is either not invest or think about investing somewhere else. And I think once you kind of get your head wrapped around that, where I've come to is you can only solve so many things within the system of environmental taxation regulation. And to a degree, we're trying to do too much with that system. And so to my mind, what we really need to fix is this incentive problem that the large final emitters face that are in the corporate world. There's some large final emitters that are utilities. They have a rate base. I wouldn't say that the same applies to them. But for those businesses that are actually competing in international markets, we need to sort out a way to make decarbonization investments work for them. And that's probably where you need to think of something like perhaps marrying a cap and trade system with a system of taxation. Or we kind of drop the entire system we've got now as it relates to large final emitters, move to a US structure, put in place a system of production tax credits, and then think about how to finance those, because they're going to be expensive. I mean, I think we're in the like 1% of GDP world. We're not in, there's a $10 billion fund that's going to solve this. And it's 1% of GDP for every year, for the next 30 or 40 years. I was just looking at the national accounts yesterday, trying to get some sense of proportion. So there's $189 billion in business investment in this country every year. People that are looking at climate change are saying there's $125 billion a year that has to happen if we're going to decarbonize. So this isn't a small thing. And what I'd say is our biggest challenge is we need to sort out what the economic instrument is that's going to be broad-based and going to drive this thing and going to be financially affordable from a public and private sector context. And so I stop there because there's a lot more I could say, but I think we need to just stop on that idea.
Ask you a question. Okay.
So, we've traditionally thought about the economic challenge of meeting emissions targets as, how do we decarbonize the economy we have in the least cost way? But I think we need to start thinking about it a bit differently, thinking more long-term and more sort of systemically, and what is happening in the world. So you mentioned China. If we look at China in terms of transportation, there are around 300 million electric 2- and 3-wheelers. That's where massive transformation is already happening. And India is on the cusp of ramping up in a similar way, like 200% growth in electric 2- and 3-wheelers between one year and another. So when we think of what's going to happen to oil and gas demand globally through this transition, and we can say the rest of the world is not pricing emissions, but the rest of the world is transitioning, and there's a lot happening that is being driven by market choices, and market's going to hit this tipping point where change happens much more quickly than we envision in models or certain scenarios. So where does Canada fit in that? What's our economic strategy in that context? And it might be more about building the economy of tomorrow, where we're going to have a lot of GDP and jobs. Some of these small companies that Leah was talking about that are going to be the Teslas of tomorrow, that are going to be the success stories for Canada. And so when we're so focused on these incumbent sectors, which are important, and they need support to reduce emissions, but we may be missing the broader picture of what is it going to take for Canada's economy to succeed in the long term.
Yeah. Can I just jump in on that?
Sure.
First of all, I've read too many Václav Smil books, and he refers to the EV cars in a lot of the world as carbon cars, because yes, they're electric vehicles, but actually electricity is coming from coal-generated electricity. And then I just worry a little bit about the point you just made, Rachel. I'd be interested in kind of your perspective on this, which is, and my perspective is, we know so little about how this transformation is going to happen. And I worry that knowing so little, we actually make very definitive, or come to very definitive conclusions about what we should be doing. And I think the approach has got to be somehow like let 1,000 flowers bloom and just see it as much as you can. For example, is the future blue hydrogen as the big replacement fuel for fossil fuels? And if the future is blue hydrogen, maybe you do want to incent CCS in the oil and gas sector so they can figure out now how to make CCS really cheap. I don't know what the world's going to look like. I don't know what the proportion of carbon extraction versus carbon replacement is going to be. So I agree with the intent and the objective. I just worry as we go down this path, we need to be really careful kind of about figuring out a way so that we don't actually go down a few dead ends, both as a country and as a globe, frankly.
Well, this actually raises a couple of questions that I wanted to put to all of you. for your perspective. And I guess I would divide them into kind of two pieces. The first is, one of the things that happens when you listen to senior government officials, either current or retired, is that they talk as if someone is actually in charge of the economy, when to the best of my knowledge, no one is in charge of the economy. The economy is a whole bunch of basically people that are trying to do the best they can, or at least what they've always done, and they're kind of moving forward. And so, you know, one of the questions that I have is, you know, are these, you know, tax, expenditure, incentive things that we kind of add to this big roiling mess of an economy, society, really going to get people to do the things that we want to do? Like who's steering? Well, I'm pretty sure no one is steering, actually. I mean, you know, people are trying to create incentives for people to go in one direction or another, but you know, it's beyond our ability to kind of make them go if they don't want to. And then the other question that kind of came up with what Leah said and what Paul said, and that is, you know, and this is really more focused on 2050 than 2030. But, you know, if you read the work of Net Zero Advisory Body, for example, you know, their argument is that, well, there's some tracks we could take, some bets we could make that will get us part of the way there, but will never get us all the way. And then there's others that we're very uncertain about, that, as Paul says, right? You know, like they say, one of my former environment colleagues would say, well, we absolutely need this great big CCS system, and we actually need to be able to have a pipeline system that will move hydrogen around the country. And if we don't do that, then we're never going to get to 2050 target. So that sounds to me like making a really big bet. You know, maybe bigger than a Volkswagen battery plant even, right? And so I guess my question is to you, how do you square the circle? I mean, how do we get these things done when, one, we're unsure about exactly what has to be done, especially as far out as we have to look, and we're not, you know, we've only got one finger on the steering wheel, if I could put it that way. So Leah, can I turn it over to you? What is there any part of those two questions you want to answer?
Sure. I mean, I think one of our challenges in Canada is we like to take US economic models and fix them at the margin and then apply them. I'm going to be a little controversial here, and then apply them to our own situation, which doesn't work for me at all, because it you know, you take the, you know, I was in discussion with the Bank of Canada folks when they came out with their scenario planning that they did with OSFI. Great study. But as you know, there's this, okay, a miracle occurs out here exogenously and we throw some new tech into our economy, and you know, and I think that's not good enough today. Like, I think we really need to understand our own situation, our own macro and micro interconnects, and the people. These are, at the end of the day, to Paul's point earlier, we have a group of regional economies that are very good at what they do and have some skills and talent that are transferable to other things. Do we know that? Do we understand it? What can we learn about that to take some initial steps to take us forward into a realm that whose steering is, we can see there are huge national strategies in China. China didn't just get all of this stuff because they were letting the market decide. It's their 5-year plan programs. You guys know that. Europe's doing the same thing. The IRA and plus the CHIPS Act and all those other the policies they put in over the last few years are national statements on where they're going to go. So given we know that, that is going to drive the next 30 years of investment. Where's Canada going to play at the margin? We're not going to hit them one-on-one. So how do we fit into those things, given the talent and skills and existent capital and knowledge infrastructure that we have, and how do we grow it? And I mean, the great thing is, we, you know, to Rachel's point earlier, actually it isn't going to be seamless, it's going to be darn frothy. So we need to figure out how we're going to talk about that, how that's going to be okay in our economy, and how we're actually going to incent that with different kinds of approaches. I love that you proposed a production tax credit or a production incentive-based approach, because I think we should have that dialogue. The stuff that we have done to date had a purpose, had a context, and matters. But I think we're in a different environment now than we have been for the last 30 or 40 years. Time to open up that new debate, I think.
Although, I mean, the two polls that you gave us were, one was China, state planning, we'll have the State Planning Commission do it, or the US, we'll just buy it, whatever we need.
Yeah, but still state, okay, still
and you have to be
planning.
the global reserve currency in order to borrow the money. We don't quite have the same financial...
I wasn't saying we should go them. That's what I said. We can't go head to head with them. We need to figure out what's right for us, which I think that's a dialogue that we really need to have badly right now.
Can I just
Sure.
speaking to the former G7, G20 deputy for finance, Mr. Boothe,
Okay.
we've actually put in place systems in the past, right, to deal with big systemic issues. So if you think of the system of flexible exchange rates, Keynes has this great quote in Essays in Persuasion, which I've been reading because it strikes me that the restructuring of our economic management approaches after the Great Depression are a bit of an analogy to the types of things that we need to be thinking about as we are confronting climate change. And Keynes has this great quote where he says, we have a magneto problem, which is alternator problem. Right. You don't have to throw the system out. Don't replace the engine, were his words. You need to fine-tune the engine. And that kind of then led to kind of Keynesian economics and the role of fiscal stabilization and flexible exchange rates. And I'll remind everybody that Canada is the first country in the world to float its exchange rate. U.S. accused us of unfair trade practices. We actually went into an IMF program, but we had the intellectual leadership to actually say, no, the way to actually manage exchange rates is to go flexible, and we went there. And I think we need to be thinking along in similar fashion as we confront climate. And so yeah, I think there are things one can do to actually incent the system. And I'd go back to the notion that I don't think the market's going to drive this. Or sorry, let me put it differently. I think governments need to put in place structures that allow markets to drive this. But on their own, the markets aren't going to go there. I just think the economics are, I mean, maybe, Leah, we come up with a technology that produces energy, in a much more available and affordable way, such that new energy can compete with, oil, gas, coal, but that's not obvious.
No, I think incentive structures need to be.
And so, I think the really interesting thing about what we've put together in Canada is we effectively have all the instruments. We need to figure out how they work together. And as between production tax credits and actually trying to sort out a carbon credit market, I'd go carbon credit market. For a whole bunch of reasons, in part because this whole question of technology choice, yes, governments will be picking winners, but really the market is going to be driving where the big money goes and enforcing it, right? How do you know you're getting your ESG reductions? Well, if you're buying a carbon credit, you're buying a carbon credit to meet an obligation. And it's going to be on your books to meet that obligation. If that credit actually turns out not to have any carbon value, you got a problem. So I think there are ways to, I think it's such a complex problem. Yes, you're going to pick winners. But if that's your only strategy, I don't think it's going to work. I mean, just in my new world, we deal with so many companies just in this country that are looking at projects. And I look at that and think, this can't be done through a government fund where everybody's kind of going to Ottawa asking for their financing. At some point, we're actually going to have a system that works such that we have some market-based financing for this stuff. And if the $125 billion in new investment required to do this transition's right, we also need to figure out a way to finance it.
So what do you say? What do you say to that?
Well, there are a few challenges. One is, yes, there are a number of new technologies and new energies that are coming out, but blue hydrogen or hydrogen in general is not going to be the same scale of value as oil and gas for Canada. So part of it is thinking about the scale of what we need to do, both for meeting our targets and for ensuring we have a strong economy 20, 30 years from now. And that scale is massive, as we've been talking about, for both of those challenges. And it means not picking winners in the sense of betting everything on hydrogen, that it's going to be the savior for us, because it won't be. And hopefully focusing on where the market failures are. So what is it that is preventing companies or international investors from making those investments we need for both our emission reductions and for our economy? What's the barrier? Is it an uncertainty problem? Well, maybe contracts for difference on the carbon price, which would guarantee a certain carbon price trajectory, would be helpful. Or production incentives can help with that as well. Or is it another investment barrier in terms of just the magnitude of the capital costs, trying to raise those funds? Maybe there's a different instrument that can tackle that. So I think if we start focusing on the market failures and what's preventing the private sector from making those big investments, we can have a more neutral policy approach that's thinking not just about the best technology bets, but the best company bets. Because some companies in Canada have enormous potential and have already demonstrated strong growth, workable technologies. We should be supporting those companies.
So not picking winning technologies, picking winners, like winners based on track records and what they've done, and I guess also some judgment about future performance, right? Because it's really, you're trying to say who is going to be really successful in the future on the things that we really care about.
We need a balanced portfolio, and to allow some risks to happen. Some things are going to fail, but then hopefully you get some things that really win that balance that out.
Well, I'd be interested in Leah's view on this, because historically, one of the great Canadian problems is commercialization, right? We have great universities, including this one, great research. We have a pretty entrepreneurial business sector that takes technologies, but then at that point where you need a deep-pocketed investor to hold a firm 10 years to kind of get established in the market, they don't do it here.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most interesting things in the time I've been in working in this space in Ottawa, is that we actually have seen a transition in understanding that commercialization is very difficult, and that it's a skill set that we probably haven't built up for about 30 years, I would say. And so if I go back to sort of 2015, as we were discussing earlier, there was this discussion in our shop always about technologies and always about this valley of death. And we, about 2 years into it, we developed an in-house micro team, and we started thinking about it in a portfolio-based approval story and strategy. And we went to where you are, Rachel, which is it's not actually about technologies at all. We're actually tech neutral today. What we're looking for is good teams with good ideas that can tell us how they think they might achieve an economic and environmental outcome, and then we give them a first phase of money to see where it goes. And if it doesn't go anywhere, then they go back and start again, and we're trying to be open-minded to that, assuming that they were appropriate in their path forward. And if it does keep to go, then we actually will come alongside and invest more. And that's a big difference, and we do that in partnership with Business Development Bank of Canada, the Strategic Innovation Funds, and others. And this is a big difference in the last few years. So instead of us sort of thinking about everybody individually and thinking that if you fail, that's a bad thing in terms of technology creation and attempt at commercialization, we're trying to put in place a pathway. So today we have actually 3 lines of business, which is seed, startup, and scale up. We didn't have that even 3 years ago. And scale up was really about, okay, if you get to the point where you need 50 to 100 million in private sector capital, you sometimes need to spend 20 million to be able to show them that they should come alongside you. And so how do we get our heads around that? How do we present that incentive? How do we share information so that the private sector can see how this firm is doing sort of under the hood as an entity that will have had at that point a 3 to 5 year relationship with that company. And this has not been easy because, as you said, Paul, like, and you would know well, our whole innovation system historically was set up to fund R&D and early stage things with the view that you didn't want to get into picking winners and losers. And so, technology readiness, all these things are really related to getting something out of a lab. That's important. But that's the poker game before the poker game, as someone very pithy said. It's 20% of the capital, it's 20% of the know-how. Actually getting this thing to market, spending the next 80% of the capital, that's the hard part. And so how do we get our heads around what, and I agree with you, it's not public policy that's going to do that per se. It's finding firms that are able to come together to try and get the talent in place to do that, because it's a completely different skill set. I'll just give you a really micro example of how we did this wrong a few years ago. So, maybe, this is quite a while ago, but maybe 8-10 years ago, there was this view that we should not do anything but demonstration, and demonstration in the minds of the folks that were working on it, who were very well-meaning and came from an R&D background, thought, okay, well, if you make $1 of revenue, we should stop funding you. Okay, well, I'm sorry, there's a big gap between $1 of revenue and profit. And in fact, to getting a little bit in the weeds, the direction we're given from government actually, and has always been, is we can fund up to significant profit. But the interpretation, because of the R&D mindset, was profit equals revenue. Okay, well that's how things operationalize on the micro scale sometimes, and you don't know how long, many years it took me to figure that out. So we could, but the point being is that, yes, how do you seed, I love the flowers blooming analogy, how do you seed 1,000 things at the 20% level? But then you have to really look at the skills and talent of the team, and it's not going to be the same team for the entire commercialization journey, potentially. How do I really look at who makes it to the first gate of the commercialization, and how do we develop public policy to go alongside that? And those are, I don't have answers to any of those, but that's what we're trying to think about today with the group of innovation funders that are out there right now.
In a couple minutes, we're going to open the floor for questions. So I just want to go back to you, Paul, for one thing that I don't want to lose sight of. It came up. Also, I noticed, a bit surprisingly for former Deputy Minister of Finance, that you quoted Mao Zedong. But anyway, that's good. This is McGill, and you've got to be open to many viewpoints. But we haven't really talked too much, just on the margins, about international developments. And of course, everything, you mentioned we're a very trade-exposed economy, and policies around the world are pretty different in some jurisdictions. Can you just say a little bit about that and what that means for us?
Yeah, I think it's critical. And I think it's critical because at some point the world's going to need to come together to sort out, like, how do we regulate this decarbonization effort and enforce it. And I see, the two big jurisdictions in the world that are probably trying to do this most systemically now are the United States and Europe. Two quite different paths, having said that. Europe having put in place a cap and trade, the US relying on its balance sheet. I think there's a real risk in all of this that if Europe, the US, Canada, and other countries incur the enormous costs to decarbonize, because it's going to cost us all a lot. There are benefits, having said that, but I think the risk is we actually don't realize the benefits because what we do is offset by another part of the world, and not for illegitimate reasons. Those other parts of the world are trying to develop. They're looking at us saying, well, you guys developed on cheap energy, why can't I? And so I think and where I think it really matters is going to be at a political level, where if we're not able to demonstrate at some point, we're not there yet, but call it 5 years' time, like global, if the net result of this is, Canada, the US, Europe reduce their carbon emissions and the rest of the world raises theirs, like at some point you kind of say this doesn't add up, and you lose political will and support for what is a massively complex endeavor. And so I think, at some point there needs to be the Bretton Woods of climate, where the main players in the world get together. And I don't think it can be done within a UN context, because the UN is just too big.
Having attended those.
Yeah, I haven't. I've been spared that. I've attended lots of G7 and G20 meetings. I think it's going to be in one of those fora that this gets resolved is too big a word, but where we're put on a path towards a solution. And the solution's not going to be beautiful, like it never is. Like the whole system of exchange rates has evolved and been pretty ugly, but grosso modo has worked. It's basically allowed us to distribute shocks around the rest of the world and not engage in massively deflationary policies as we did in the 30s. And so what we need is some form of infrastructure internationally that lets us, it's either going to be a carbon border. I don't have it in my head actually what it is, but is it a carbon border adjustment? Is it some form of an internationally enforced carbon tax? I think that's too much for the U.S. But something along those lines needs to be sorted out. It's easier for Europe. They're not a big energy producing jurisdiction, so they can do a cap and trade. It's harder for energy producing jurisdictions to actually deal with this. But I think the international dimension of this is going to be critical, and I think just as important as anything else we're talking about, because the things that we're doing domestically at some point become unsustainable if you can't translate that benefit.
So, quick comment from Rachel, and then we'll go to the floor.
Yeah, I think we're not sure that fossil fuels are going to be the cheap energy source for the next 30 years, because the transition might not play out as this smooth line, as I was saying earlier. And we're going to see, as companies aren't investing in supply because there's an uncertain demand down the line, you're going to see shortages and then price spikes. And as North America becomes an LNG, liquefied natural gas exporter to the world, we're going to start facing the global price for natural gas here, which is going to be a lot higher than what we've gotten used to in Canada. So, and solar energy's come down massively. So places like India and Africa, they might not be developing on the same path that the rest of the world has. So I think we just need to think more open mind about what that transition could look like globally.
Okay. So hopefully you have some pithy questions to ask. I will just say, if you can't express your question in 30 seconds, then you haven't thought about it enough. So please try to do that. Please try to do that. And the other thing that we'll do, and we'll ask our panelists for pithy answers to the pithy questions. And maybe what we could do is take them in pairs. We'll take one and then another and then answer, and then one and another and answer. And here's one right here. Melka.
Thanks. I agreed with almost everything I heard, except one thing, and it was Rachel. And I have to say, just so everybody knows, Rachel and I go way back. I have great respect for her. But WTF? What are you talking about? The government should be picking winners. Because I agree that we have to stay away from technology preferences, but what makes you think that the government could choose the right company?
Don't answer that. Yet. Oh. Who's question number two? Pedro.
All right, when the U.S. sneezes, Canada catches a cold. So we now have a massive investment through IRA, and because we are part of the Made in North America plan, which includes, is based on national security and all that jazz, we see the government of Canada, and especially ISED, with a serious strategy on supply chain. recognizing that a lot of the drivers around the future are actually going to come from the south, right? And we better get on that train. And there's been tremendous work done around that. So risks, opportunities of being that, continuing that integration, especially in this very uncertain time that we're about to live in.
Okay, defend yourself, and then and I'll ask you to respond to question number 2.
So I do not like a model where we have a giant pot of money and there's bureaucrats out there deciding which company is deserving of it. So I do not like that model of picking winners. However, when we're talking about energies or technologies, there's a lot of talk about which ones are going to be the saviors of the future and where we have to go all in. And I would say that's a form of picking winners as well, in the sense that you're precluding all of those other great technological opportunities and companies out there that might provide more growth, jobs, environmental benefits to Canada. And one example of that, when everyone talks about the transition, they're talking about renewable energy, hydrogen, electric vehicles, no one talked about battery recycling, electric vehicle battery recycling. But Canada has a great company, Li-Cycle, that's growing rapidly and expanding in the US, that recycles electric vehicle batteries. But if we only pick those technologies that we associate with the transition and we're not thinking about the broader picture and where there might be a great company out there, we may be missing out on those growth opportunities. So it's not about having a system where bureaucrats are picking it, it's making sure that your system is open enough to capture those.
Can I defend Rachel for just 30 seconds?
She did a really good
She did a good job, yeah.
Kudos, Li-Cycle. We invested in them a long time ago.
My defense would be, you got to think of the financial system in Canada, which is a highly risk-averse system and designed as such and has served us well. We've built structures around that to try to incent risk capital coming in. We set up the BDC, the Export Development Corporation, in some ways SDTC. Recently there's this kind of interesting thing, this Canada Business Growth Fund that the government's kind of pushed the banks together on. So my thing on picking winners would be, it's not the government so much, and maybe the Business Growth Fund, maybe the Canada Growth Fund will actually evolve in this direction, but it seems to me there is a risk capital part of our financial structure that needs bolstering. And the key is how you the governance around that, so that you don't have the government picking winners, but you have some kind of market-like structure that actually can drive that. Otherwise, I worry that in a highly risky area, we're going to lose a lot. And the history, as I say, would suggest if you don't look at what people say, look at what they do. Is that we have over the years tried to build structures to deal with that, not wanting to move to a US-style financial system.
Leah, can you also respond to question 2?
Yeah.
Okay, I would just build on this one as well. If you look at our companies that are moving into scale up, almost none of their capital comes from Canada today, unless it comes from the entities you just mentioned. So we have this huge gap in mid-market capital finance in Canada because of the structures, for other reasons, and I think that's important. Okay, the Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS Act, U.S. policy. So first of all, I think that these kinds of policies are great for us, controversially, because it actually makes us think about what exactly you asked is, okay, so where are we going to play? Because we can't play one-to-one. And so on the first level, it's how are we going to, given that there's exemptions for us to the Made American policy, how are we going to play into that supply chain future? And that was, earlier I mentioned some of the SMEs that are working in that area, and so we should be thinking about that holistic strategy as one pillar of a potential 30-year future. And then we should think about the others. Europe was here just a little bit ago, wanting to work with us on green hydrogen all the way back to electrolyzers. We have some expertise in that area. Is there a 30-year future where we could think about incentive structures on that supply chain? So to your point, I think there are some things we already have private infrastructure and supply chain infrastructure in that we'll want to think about how they transition. And there are some others that we should think about where we have know-how and partnerships that we could build up with others, which would not be with the United States, and go to a portfolio strategy where we try to do both. Key to this will be actually public policy that allows us to play into those trade environments. And I think that squaring that circle and really understanding some strategy long term on that is something that'd be really important for us in the next few years.
So let me go to question 3 and question 4.
I actually think she's 4.
Okay, sorry. Question 3 and question 4. I guess I don't have to just go like this, right? It's not mechanical. 3 and 4. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. I have a question about economic modeling and policy. So I understand a lot of our policy ideas are informed by economic models that assume equilibrium. And we see a lot of new methods coming from the UK universities that they go into more dynamic modeling. Do you think we're led astray by our old modeling methods? And yeah.
I want you to wait until we hear from question 4.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Apologies, I think this is going to be questions 4 and 5. But my first question is to tug a little bit on what Paul had mentioned before about wanting a new, I guess, Bretton Woods for climate with the main players. I was hoping that you could expand more on what you mean by main players, especially considering that the Bretton Woods system has been criticized in the past for not including countries in the global south that we know do have a substantial role in, impacting climate change. And my second question is less systematic and more specific to the heavy emitters issue. Do you think that there's any possibility for countries to be able to get together to start to regulate how we want to, I guess, either tax or regulate these heavy emitters on a global scale at any time soon? Thanks.
Okay. Who wants to start?
I can start with the modeling one if
Okay.
you want. Paul can jump in on that too. Modeling tools have been enormously important to the progress that Canada has made so far and can be very informative, particularly when you're talking about things that are going to be happening 10, 20, 30 years in the future. But we have relied on them perhaps too much, and we need to recognize what's missing from those and also be fully aware of all the assumptions that have gone into that modeling process, whether it's technology costs, or one of the biggest concerns I've had is that those models do not capture the economic benefits well. So they are very good at measuring the cost to the economy of the economy we have today. They are terrible at predicting the potential economy we could have 20 years from now and all the growth and jobs and benefits that could be created from that. So when we're making decisions, I think we have to be, go in with open eyes as to what the model is telling us and what it's not telling us and where we need to look elsewhere.
On modeling, I'd like to jump in. I think the models, I'm not sure actually what the line of causation is, but I think the models people become captive to their models. And the models end up encapsulating a worldview that often is only partial. For example, most models that a government department will use actually don't have a corporate financing dimension to it. And so you're running these models kind of implicitly assuming things about how one part of the economy is going to react that isn't necessarily right. And then you continue down this path. And I think that's actually a big issue right now, where we've become somewhat model dependent in how we're looking at this problem. And people need to kind of step back and think of it in all of its dimensions and complexity. My analogy would be M1 as the monetary aggregate in inflation targeting in the 70s and 80s, where it took a long while for the central bankers to realize that actually M1 wasn't really dependable as a monetary guide to where inflation was going. And I feel as though we're kind of at the same point now with environment, where we got all these constructs, and you need a construct. I'm not saying you don't need a model. Absolutely, you need a model. This is a complicated thing, but your model can really deceive you. Maybe I'll give you one anecdote from the Department of Finance, which was an important one, where in 2007, when I was kind of the ADM looking at what's going on in the US, the guys were the folks doing the economic forecasting were saying, we think this is all going to get sorted out because, the economy is going to adjust. And we kind of talked it through, and I said, well, you think it's going to get sorted out because you have a perfectly equilibrating model. And effectively, the model can't even contemplate the disequilibrium situation in which we found ourselves. So I said, well, why don't we go back and think about, an older form of models that actually became new, stock adjustment models, which became error correction models, and start from the disequilibrium situation. And when they did that, they came back and said, oh, okay, now we got a problem. Like, we think U.S. housing prices could fall 35%, biggest recession in the history of the United States. So you've got to be really, these models are powerful. They can tend to capture worldviews or become very, almost like a theology, but they can lead you astray. I think that's a critical point that was just raised.
Leah, could you take on the who are the players, big players, small players, which was question 4, I think, and then maybe Paul, you could talk about the global south, which was question 5.
Right.
Yeah, who are the big players? Well, I think it's a really great question. I forget the agency, maybe someone here remembers, but a few years ago, some good analysis was done that basically said 80% of emissions come from 260 companies globally. And I wish we would update that every year, because when you think about that, it's a lot easier to envision how you might get a G7 discussion or a G25 or a global discussion, Bretton Woods kind of discussion, and who the players in the room would need to be. Because those 250, 60 companies probably are in X nations, and now all of a sudden you know who to convene. And you'd have a very diverse group probably that we never have convened before, because you'd have a lot of mining and oil and gas kinds of nations and consuming nations that do manufacturing. So anyway, I think it's a really interesting question, and that piece of analysis and a convening that held a dialogue, now all of a sudden maybe you could do something very interesting from a policy perspective across nation, or at least have some coalition building. So that would be an idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree with the Global South comment. They're absolutely going to have to be part of the discussion and dialogue. I guess the question is, what kickstarts that dialogue? And I don't quite see the Global South actually coming together on this. Interestingly enough, they're most affected. And so in a sense, they have most to gain by a global strategy and a global approach. But whatever we do has got to be with a view to how does the Global South continue to develop. And there was actually a question also on your second or your fifth question on carbon, on how do we come together. And I think that's a relevant question too, because I would have thought what Canada needs to be thinking about long term are either carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and probably both of these things, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and global trading of carbon credits. You've got California on a fuel basis, Europe with a cap and trade. We have carbon credits underneath our clean fuel standard and our output-based pricing system. Like, if ever there's a way to kind of knit those things together, you then have the potential for something that looks like securities markets in the climate world, which I think would be hugely valuable.
So, hold your fire.
You have more questions.
I'd like to reserve a few minutes at the end for a public opinion survey that you can all participate in. So maybe I could just take 3 more questions, and that will be it.
There's 4 people standing.
You're being exclusionary.
4 questions.
Why don't you take all
this
4?
This is the thing you find when you're a deputy minister. Your staff is always saying, well, could we just have a little bit more? Okay, 4 more questions, please. So you're number 5, 6, and then who's next? 7, 8, 9? Everybody's in. Okay, pithy, very pithy.
I think 8 and 9 should do rock, paper, scissors. So I just wanted to take stock of some of the comments made at the front end of the presentation, which has been fantastic, by the way, around the role of policy to correct market failures, to incent change, and taking into account the recent budget that the federal government tabled, where this is probably a fundamental shift, where we're seeing, more market incentives through the ITCs and some of the other programs that are designed in principle to accelerate higher levels of investment in Canada. But at the same time, we know that there's a number of other regulatory mechanisms coming through the system, whether it's clean electricity regulations, a potential cap on the oil and gas sector, methane regulations, ZEB mandates, etc. So effectively, we've got a kind of a combination of carrots and sticks at this point in time. If you had to provide advice to policymakers, would it be hold the course and continue with this carrot and stick approach, or would you be suggesting emphasis on either a more regulatory approach or a more market-based approach that would incent higher levels of change?
Okay, so you got that?
Thank you. So I think we talked about how government should behave, and we talked about how firms should behave. Do we need more money and direct investments to change how people behave? For example, does the world think, the world, not the folks in this rooms or rooms like this, does the world think about rising sea levels the same way as we once did about the hole in our ozone layer?
All right, so you have mentioned that formulating incentives for big players to drive change is important. And I'm wondering, how did the recent mega acquisitions and mega mergers in Canada align with those goals of energy transition? And how do you see that going forward, especially like creating essentially larger and larger players that become stronger and stronger, and their voices become stronger and stronger, so their opposition also can become stronger and stronger?
Ability to resist gets stronger and stronger.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, okay. Last but not least.
Yes, so my question is actually somewhat similar to the previous question on this side, so hopefully you'll have 3.5 questions to go through.
Okay.
So there's a lot of money out there being promised with sustainable considerations, but clean projects are still starved for capital and not being built quickly enough. What do you see as the biggest frictions in this pipeline from capital to construction? And how much policy innovation do we need on the financial incentive side versus more of the expediting approval side? Thank you.
Okay, who wants to start?
I can answer two at once.
Okay.
I'd do the first and the last together. And I think our biggest issue is we haven't sorted out a proper incentive structure for the industrial sector to actually invest. The US has provided a direction now. And you know, we can go in that direction. My preference in answer to the first question would be take the system we have now, knit it together, and create a deep and enduring domestic market for carbon credits. And then the last thing I'll say is, as you do that, you have to be careful. You have to be careful about how many things you're trying to do with your system of environmental regulation. I think we're at the point where we need to sit back and say, let's set aside all the equity issues that come out of it. Let's figure out what needs to be done to solve the environmental problem. Once we've done that, let's step back and look at things like taxation to deal with maybe some of the effects of what we've done on the environmental side that we're not so happy about as a society.
Leah, which ones do you want to take on?
I think I might build on the last question and what Paul just said. So Li-Cycle, which is an interesting battery recycling company here in Canada, I want to just tell you a story about them because it pulls into policy gaps, I think. And the question about should we focus on regulatory timelines and how do we get commercialization. So Li-Cycle is a basic company. We funded them, I think, 4 or 5 years ago, and they went public in the recent public market, just a year and a half ago, on the public market SPAC furor that went on. Li-Cycle built their main manufacturing facility after their pilot facility in Kingston in the United States and New York. They actually looked at Ontario and New York State for that facility. And the reason they picked New York was threefold. First of all, the regulatory timeline in the United States, which had to do, in Ontario, which had to do with the classification of batteries as a hazardous waste versus an input to a commercial entity, which is what it was in New York, took a year to 2 longer for regulatory approval. Okay? Simple definitional regulatory structure, dealt with differently in 2 states that are abutting. Just put that as an example. The second was, and this we could have probably competed on, was municipal, state, and federal incentive structures that were open and wanting to develop recycling, and then nearness to market. Although the nearness to market wasn't the biggest factor, it was the first two, because where they were looking at Ontario had good nearness to market in the United States as well. Although there would have been regulatory risk related to import-export of those materials, given they were classified as hot and hazardous waste in Ontario. So what I would say is, all the things Paul said are really important, but we have to get down into that kind of weed. The plant that was built on the first commercial scale-up was built in New York State, like 250 kilometers away from where it could have been built in Ontario, because of a very simple group of reasons that I found out very late in the game of decision, and so couldn't introduce them to the right people to try and resolve. But those are the kinds of things we need to understand happen as well, identify them earlier as barriers to new market entry for new technology and new companies, and help put in place structures to move them along.
Rachel, you have the weighty responsibility of dealing with any unaddressed questions.
Okay, well, the biggest problem I think we need to solve is uncertainty. Because, I think if investors and companies knew how things were going to play out over the next 10, 20, 30 years, investment would flow. So I'm hoping that we can come up with instruments to solve that certainty problem. It may be contracts for difference. It may be, some cross-party agreements, maybe some international agreements that involve trade where there's more certainty on how markets are going to evolve there. But those are going to be sort of the critical foundation. And then on the, individual action question, part of the distraction from the real action on climate change has been this idea that it's the responsibility of individuals to change their lives, and then that will drive change. I think we've realized that that's probably the wrong way to go about it. We need to focus on the large corporations, the big investments, getting that investment happening, and then the products will be available at an affordable price for consumers to purchase. And there may need to be some government role in that, in terms of making sure that low-income people, for example, are not bearing the cost burden of transition. But largely, it's about getting those products out there in an affordable way.
Okay. So we're just about at the end of the time. I will tell you, I've warned our panelists in advance that I was going to do this, and I wonder if I could have 2 Max Bell staff members for the conference to come up to do some counting for me in a second. Can I have 2 of you come up? And before I do that, though, and I apologized to Leah in advance that I can't ask this question of her because it's not appropriate for a senior official in the government. But my question is, it has 2 parts. Do you think we have currently in place the measures that we need to get to our A, 2030 target, and B, 2050 target? So we've talked about all these things that are happening, all these measures. Rachel and Paul, are we on track with current measures for 2030? Raise your hand.
No.
Don't have to comment.
Okay. So yes is raise hand?
What? If you believe we are, raise your hand. Okay. 2030? 2050?
Yeah, we have a structure we can work with, so you have to be careful not to be saying like throw everything out here. If it's a quantitative question, no, we're not going to hit those targets.
Right.
If it's
with current measures.
With current measures. Having said that, I think we actually have an interesting set of measures that few other countries have that if we were smart, we could work with.
Yeah.
Same.
It's about building on what we have, doing more and thinking more broadly.
See, we conspired. We knew you were going to ask.
So what I'm taking from this, though, is that what we have in place now is not enough. And what we have to do is more. We've talked a lot about the more, but we have to do more if we're going to get to 2030, 443 megatons, as I recall, or 2050 net zero. So the last thing I'd like to do, are my counters here? Okay. I'd like to ask the same question of you. So maybe you could count on this side and you could count on this side. So anyone who thinks that we have enough in place to get to 2030 targets, put up your hand. Oh, this is so easy. with current policies.
And current stringency.
Put up your hand if you believe it. And when I say put up your hand, I mean put up your hand. Okay, so sorry, this was so easy. What about 2050? Oh, there you go, contrarian. Yes, 2?
Kind of.
So maybe the last thing you could do is just count how many people are here. Anyway, I think my sense of the room is that while we've got a bunch of systems in place and measures begun, they're not really enough to get us where we need to go, and more work needs to be done. And that's where I would turn it back to Chris.
Thank you. So that means we will hang around for the rest of the day and continue to discuss, because clearly we have more work to do. I'm going to add one question into the mix, but it's for you to consider when you are having your coffee. Remember at the an hour and a half ago when I said 11 economists, 1 lawyer, and 3 political strategists walked into a room? Remember that? One of those political strategists was Ken Bosenkool, and he just sent in a note that I missed an hour ago from my family gives me a lot of grief, actually, that I don't manage my phone as well as I should, okay? I think they should live with it. So he sent in the question, and here it is. And it actually is quite apropos for what has just happened. The engineer, that would be you, Leah. The engineer says technology moves forward exponentially, and the economist, I think he's talking about you, Rachel, says progress will not be smooth but lumpy. If those things are true, then does the panel think that aggressive targets for 2030 might in fact impede progress toward net zero for 2050? In other words, he said, are there things we will have to do to hit the 2030 targets that will prevent some of the lumpier exponential changes we need to get to net zero in 2050? So just in case you did not have enough things to think about while you break and have coffee, you can address Ken Bosenkool's question. I'll come back, report back with an answer 30 minutes from now. Let me just thank the panel, Leah, Paul, Rachel, Paul. Wonderful way to kick this off. I just invite you back now into the other room for coffee and croissant and other things. And then we'll be back here at 11 o'clock sharp. Thank you very much.